Today I'm going to show you 5 different types of hooks that you can use in your song regardless of style or genre to make your songs interesting and really captivate listeners. So let's jump in and take a look. So first, I've just got a little melodic house loop loaded up here. Just got some samples like kicks and claps. By the way, if you do want some great hat samples and other drum samples, do check out our free EDM starter kit, which has a bunch of different drums, synths, 808 effects and Foley samples, serum presets and more. Grab that for free down below. And a couple of shaker loops I've added in here as well. Got a little bass loop, a background pad, some chords and an ARP as well. So the first type of hook is just a full vocal. Now I've kind of structured these into most effective for grabbing listeners' attention to probably less effective, but still effective nonetheless. And the reason vocals in their fullness work so well is because they're so captivating. The human voice is just something that instantly hooks in a listener because they recognize it so distinctly. If you listen to the main vocal turned on with this loop, you'll hear how much it just fits right in the pocket. It's in the right key, it's in the right BPM. Instant hook, right? And so there's a number of different ways you can work with vocals. I've grabbed this vocal sample off Splice, just happened to be one in the BPM and key of my song. Of course, you can find vocal samples that aren't in the BPM and key of your song and make them work with warping and repitching. Of course, you can use vocal samples just verbatim like I have here. However, when using vocal samples from Splice, I recommend doing a bit of manipulation just to make them your own because other people are likely going to be using the same samples. Now, the second way to do this would be, of course, to work with a vocalist. The benefit to doing this is that they're able to record a full verse, chorus kind of structure along with your full arrangement rather than a snippet of a vocal sample, which you kind of have to work around and can get a bit repetitive. The other benefit of working with a vocalist is that they normally have good vocal processing skills, so you don't have to do that yourself, although you absolutely can do the processing yourself and have that greater level of flexibility. Now, the third kind of category here is a little bit less known. It's sampling vocals from obscure sources. Now, you can go onto sites like YouTube and type in random phrases. For example, I could type in gun speech 1984 or something and, you know, get some random, I don't know, speech on guns and sample that. And it's less about the original sound being super musical and how we transform it into something musical. And this can be a great way in certain more underground genres like deep house, techno.
Father looks at her and he says, he can't go through life doing what he wants to do.
Where you can chuck these snippets in and they kind of hook listeners. And of course, the fourth kind of option here is to record your own vocals if that's something you're comfortable with. You can process them yourself if you have those skills. And of course, there's a number of different ways you can make them sound. You can make them sound as poppy or as subdued or as ethereal or as aggressive as you like with the right amount of processing. Either way, picking one of these vocal methods is going to be really helpful because vocals are going to allow your music to stand out a lot more strongly than any of the other forms I'm going to cover here. We're going to jump into number 2 here, which is to actually use both vocals and a melody. That melody can be on a synth or an instrument or a combination of both. What I've got here, if I just turn on this both group, is I've got the original vocal sample that we used, except this one's chopped up. Again, this is probably a better use and example of manipulating a vocal sample to make it your own. But we've also got this lead I've introduced here, which is a serum patch, creating sort of like a nice saw-based melodic house lead. I'm going to play this along with the track now. I've turned off the original main vocal, and you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. So there's a couple of keys here with working with both a vocal and the melody to say, create a hook, right? You have to interplay between them quite strategically to get it to work. I've got the first kind of 3 beats rather here of the vocal, and then the lead kind of comes in on beat 4, leading into bar 2, and then the vocal comes back in. Now, you don't have to be as like choppy and like methodical with this. There can be a bit of overlap between the 2 phrases. Musically, it doesn't have to be like one stops when the other starts exactly on the beat. For example, I could drag this out. You You could do something like that if you felt so inclined. The other key here, though, besides compositionally getting them to work, and obviously this involves picking good phrases from the vocal and also writing the right kind of melody to suit what's going on. You can see here that they kind of sit in a similar note range, right? It's not like the vocal is sitting up here and the other lead part is sitting down here in sort of range. I mean, that could work in certain circumstances, but it just doesn't in a lot of cases. The other part, though, is sonically you need to get the vocals sounding similar to the lead and vice versa. So, for example, you'll see here there's both an echo on the lead and the vocal. Now, the echo device actually comes from the lead itself, which gives it that nice kind of analog echo, space echo type vibe, right? Bit of reverb on the send there as well, of course, and on the vocal. But I wanted to create that same sort of vibe on the vocal in a lesser way, because obviously the vocal, we kind of want to be not super delayed, so it's clear. But you can hear there's a bit of delay there.
But I can be.
And that's just allowing both of these instruments in their own unique way, at their own unique level, to be affected in the same way. Now, of course, you can go beyond this and say on the group, provide some sort of group processing. For example, I could go ahead and add some multiband compression using the multiband compression preset of Ableton's multiband dynamics, just to gently massage the sounds together, maybe at say 30%. This is a nice mixing technique, but I obviously could do some stylistic choices as well. For example, I could decide that I want some like bit rate reduction on the vocal and the lead together.
You make me nervous every time, but I can be.
And you could see how that sounds in context.
You make me nervous every time, but I can be. Yeah.
Now, in this case, I don't really like the redux. It's more of a stylistic choice, so I'm going to remove that there. But you can also combine the sound of the two elements together with that technique. So moving on to the full lead, which is number 3 here. The full lead is basically the same lead I used here, but instead of having a vocal, it's just a melodic synth. Now, this is obviously going to make your music instrumental at this point, which is totally fine. And a lot of you watching this are probably producers wanting to make instrumental music. Of course, a vocal track generally commercially performs better. That's not me saying you shouldn't write instrumental tracks. It's just me pointing a general fact out, right? So no one get mad at me in the comments for saying that's the case, because it's just true. You can still make a really good instrumental track, and there've been plenty of examples of tracks that have no vocal whatsoever that have had commercial success, right? The difference here is, of course, you need to have quite a catchy melody. Now, one great technique that I've covered many times on this channel, in my emails and everywhere on our blog, is this idea that a good melody is normally still one that can be sung. And this is probably the closest you're going to get to quote unquote vocals without actually having a vocal in your track. For example, this melody here. Let's play it along with our track. I've just enabled it. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. You know, it instantly sticks in your head, and it's designed that way on purpose because I've written it along with my kind of humming and whistling skills and singing skills to be able to make sure it's memorable like that. You'll see here also compared to the part lead, it fills out a little more. There's a few moments here where it's a bit more simple, and there's a few moments here where it's a bit more complex. And that's what normally I find a good melody has, a bit of a combination of both, but you never want it to get so complex that it becomes difficult to hear. Right? You have to find that nice sweet spot. Now, of course, when you have a full lead taking up the space in the mix, it might be a bit louder than as if there was no other instrument, right? So we're going to have it pretty loud in the mix. The other thing here is there's a lot of space created by the other instruments, so I'm not too worried about having to boost up the volume or do some crazy processing. Just good sound selection and good composition should allow your lead to poke through the mix, much the same it would allow a vocal. Now, you can use any type of sound here. For example, I could switch this to a piano, and equally, it would be as effective, right? So I could load up, let's go to Piano V2, which is by Arturia. right? I might need to get a bit more expressive with the MIDI. So maybe really quickly, I'm going to add on a velocity device to the beginning of this and just add a little bit of random and bring the out high. Bit of random. And bring up the volume to compensate. I might, to make this a little more electronic sounding, add a bit of multi-band compression. Add some gain into that multi-band compression. Turning off the original. Right, so this goes for any instrument or any sound. It's just about picking the right lead sound. Generally, though, you want one that has quite a bit of character to it so that it pokes through the mix, but also has a very distinctive flavor to it. You know, if it's kind of a too washed out reverby type lead, it's going to make it difficult to hear in the mix. Now, obviously, there's some stylistic choice with the type of lead sound you're using, depending on the genre you're making. For example, a bit more of a washed out reverby lead might actually work in a melodic house track like this, but you can still see that despite it's got a lot of reverb on it, it's still clear and got a lot of character. So that would be my recommendation. And so number 4, we're getting into a few more unique techniques here, which I would say would be the chords kind of functioning as their own hook. Now, this happens in a lot more underground genres like deep house, Chicago house, and techno, where there's not a clear melody, right? There might be a vocal sample interspersed with the chords, which would kind of be similar to this both technique we covered. But apart from that, the chords kind of generally drive the hook. Now, this could come in the form of, say, a chord sample. Sometimes that's pitched around on a sampler. For example, I could grab like a nice chord sample from my library here. You know, I could grab this into my library here, pitch it up on the sampler, and let's go up an octave. Add a bit of attack to get rid of that click. Right, that's a nice kind of vibe there. It's kind of a classic house sound, right? But for this particular style, obviously, it's different. For example, what I've done here is I've taken my original chords, which I'll turn off here, and instead of kind of rhythmified them in a bit more of a unique way. I've also made the chords more obvious by opening up the filter in Serum. So, of course, when the chords are going to be the main element, you want them to have some sort of character, much like we were talking about the lead, so that they stick out in the track. Got a bit of distortion, multi-band compression, and some sculpting EQ just to kind of make them fit in the mix. But let's just play this along with my track here. Now, one thing I like to do with chords sometimes to make them even stronger is to kind of pick the main tone and pitch it up an octave or layer it up an octave. Now, I've also added in kind of this common tone between all the chords here to kind of give it this nice blended, unique feeling. Makes the chords feel a lot more emotional, but I have to go and pick out the actual real top note of the chords here. So this one doesn't count. It's these ones, these ones, these ones, this one. And then so we're going to copy and paste it up the octave. And so here the top note of the chord is kind of functioning as a melody, which is pretty cool. Now, of course, you don't have to have the rhythm as rapid as I do here. You could still have more like sparse kind of chords. And then lastly, we've just got this idea of the bass or some sort of rhythmic element which could or could not have like a melodic component being the main element. So if I just remove this little Rhodes thing I added and turned off my chord rhythm, putting back on the original chords, I'm going to actually turn off the original bass here and turn on this solo bass. And the idea here is that this bass is the hook. Now, in more bass-oriented genres like dubstep, drum and bass, rhythm, certain hybrid trap styles, future bass even sometimes, bass tends to be, and in a lot of cases, is the only main element, right? So it's important in those genres that you kind of get the bass from a sound design and compositional perspective really solid. In this track, I've made the bass a lot more interesting than I would have been if it was just more of a supportive element like it is up here, and you'll hear what I mean. I'm just going to play this for you now. Right, so what we've got going on here is just the filter's a lot more open on the main saw bass. There's a lot more movement. So you can see here, I'm moving it to kind of create some interest. You'll see in the MIDI though, more importantly, there's a lot of octave jumps. I actually based it off the chord rhythm we had before as the basis here of the rhythm. So it's like dun, 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 dun. But I added lots of flair to it with like octave runs like this, little motifs, little fifth runs and octave runs, removing certain notes and letting certain ones ring out, going up the octave there, and then a bit of a motif here. And so you see here that this just has a lot more interest and kind of captures listeners. Now, basses are hard to remember because they tend to be quite deep and they're difficult to sing, but you can at least get a nice groove going that makes the track so enjoyable that people kind of hook onto it, at least in their brain, and they keep listening to it, right? Now, again, it's recommended the bass here has some sort of character. I've got the filter moving, but I've also got saturation, OTT. It's got some pumping with the kick from the sidechain, and just some nice kind of effects, some distortion. Now, of course, in certain genres, sound design is going to be a huge part of the sound because the notes aren't necessarily changing. You know, for example, in dubstep, you could just be using one note and it's all about just the rhythm of that note and then the sound design. In which case you want to make sure that instead of dialing in like crazy, note runs, that you're dialing in really interesting movements in the sound. For example, I could add some movement to the comb filter. Here it's actually turned off, so I could turn it back on. Maybe I won't use that because it doesn't sound that great. Could modulate the add bass filter there. You're making psytrance, you could do this kind of thing. Blend the dry wet. Again, this is going to be very different for different styles and you have to decide how you're going to do it. But the amount of sound design, generally is going to be proportional to the amount of notes in the instrument, right? So the more notes you've got going on, you can get away with a more simpler sound. But if it's more just simple notes, the sound design matters a lot more. Now, that's kind of it today for the 5 types of hooks, guys. I hope you got something out of this video. And remember to grab our EDM starter kit down below if you want a bunch of great sounding drums, synth samples, synth presets, and even some great free guides on how to make electronic music. Grab that below. If you enjoy this video, give it a like and leave a comment letting me know what you'd like to see on the channel next, and subscribe so you don't miss the next video. But apart from that, guys, thanks for sticking around, and until next time, happy producing.